Be the envy of the neighborhood. 860 KKAT, where the grass is always greener. Welcome to Gardening Utah. Here's composter and show hoster, Jana Francis.
Welcome to Gardening Utah. I am your host, Jana Francis. Every week here on Gardening Utah, we give you gardening inspiration and advice from experts across the state. And boy, do we have an expert for you today. We talk about all things vegetables, flowers, trees, shrubs, and of course, your lawn. Thank you so much for listening to Gardening Utah. We hope that this show is something you'll really look forward to checking in with every week. Episodes drop every weekend on Apple Podcasts to inspire you and inform you as you work in the yard or maybe while you're out and about hitting up the garden centers. And at Gardening Utah, we want to make sure you stay in the know of the tasks you need to accomplish each week in the garden. So when you subscribe to our podcasts on Apple or wherever you get your podcasts, you can make sure you never miss an episode. And we also air on the radio Saturdays and Sundays at 10 a.m. on KKAT 860 a.m. I am so excited for today's show. I say that every week. You can tell that this is something that I truly love, being able to take an hour and sit down and really talk about gardening, which is one of my very favorite passions. But today's show is so cool because we have an actual genius, a plant genius, a garden genius with us on the show. And I can't wait to tell you about her in just a minute. But first, the tip of the week.
860 KKAT with your Gardening Utah tip of the week.
My tip of the week is plant your tomatoes deep. Now, many of you savvy gardeners know these tips already, but it is so timely, so let's go. We are close enough away from our last frost date, which is May 15th, depending on where you are in the state, to where we can safely plant tomatoes. Now, transplanting tomatoes is very different than other seedlings. With other seedlings, you plant the seedling at the soil level, but with tomatoes, you want to plant about half of the seedling below the soil level. Tomatoes will put out roots from the stem wherever it is in contact with soil. So planting it deeply will give the plant a very large and healthy root system. And make sure to trim off any branches off the sides that will end up being buried. Now, after digging a deep hole, make sure to add fertilizer or compost to the hole before planting the tomato. Also make sure to give your tomatoes plenty of space, at least 24 to 48 inches between plants. This will let the light into the lower portions of the mature plants and improve airflow. One last tomato tip, more sun equals more fruit. So choose your sunniest garden spot because tomatoes soak up sunshine just like water. Aim for at least 7 hours of sunshine a day. And that was the tip of the week.
Never miss a tip for your garden and never miss an episode. The Gardening Utah Podcast with Jana Francis at 860KKAT.com/garden. Here's Jana Francis.
Okay, everybody, here's what we've got on tap for today's show. In a minute, I'm going to tell you all about Liz Hamilton, who's going to be our guest today. But first, I'll tell you what we're going to talk about. The very first segment, we're going to be talking about monarch butterflies and a very important plant to monarch butterflies that is starting to come up in a lot of our gardens right now called milkweed. So we're going to talk about the importance of milkweed to feed the monarch butterflies. And Liz is really going to give us a ton of information and understanding around how they're endangered and things like that. So that'll be the first segment. And then the last two segments of our show, we're going to deep dive into planting your vegetables, because obviously this is creeping up on the average last frost date for Utah, and some of us are daring to put in our plants. Now, granted, I live kind of in a pocket a little bit, but I had frost all over my lawn and all over my thyme and a lot of my herbs this morning. So I'm really glad that I haven't yet set anything out in my garden, but I was definitely planning on doing that this weekend and kind of risking it until, May 15th is the average last frost date, as I mentioned earlier. But so we will see what I end up doing this weekend. But Liz and I are going to get all the way into the things that you need to consider before putting in your garden. And I realized that a lot of those things have start with S. So the soil, the site, the shade, the sunshine, and we'll get into all the rest. But we kind of help you figure out the best place and the best way to get your garden in this weekend or in the next coming weeks, depending on where it is you live in Utah. Now, let's get into all about Liz Hamilton. So, pun intended, Liz is very firmly rooted in the Salt Lake Valley gardening community. She has been a plant nut her whole life. She grew up in the DC metro area, and she spent her childhood visiting the historic gardens and parks of the East Coast. And when in college, she spent her summers on Capitol Hill working at the United States Botanical Gardens and the U.S. National Arboretum as a horticultural assistant. She has a BS and MS in parks management, and after moving to Salt Lake in 2007, she completed an additional BS in horticulture from Utah State University. Now, it's been a bit, but Liz spent 4 years working as a horticulturist for Salt Lake County, stationed out of Wheeler Historic Farm, and she managed the ground care of several different park locations totaling 100 acres. From fruit tree pruning and vegetable gardening to native habitat restoration and design, she has worn a lot of different hats in the field, but is most passionate about edible landscaping and unusual species. In 2018, she started a small horticulture consulting business that lets her spend more time with her 2 little girls at home while still being firmly rooted in the Salt Lake Valley gardening community. And you can find her at progressiveplants.com and then click design. And that's where you'll find how to contact Liz. Now, Progressive Plants, you've heard them on the show a few times, and Cameron Alcott has some great things to say about Liz as well. And I just had to read this because he had actually sent me a text about Liz, and I just thought it would be hilarious to read it on air because Liz is amazing. I can't wait for you to meet her in just a minute, but this is what Cameron has to say about Liz. I hope you have yourself strapped in. Today, I have the queen of cucurbits, the goddess of gymnosperms, I hope I said that right, the destroyer of dandelions, the bane of bindweed, the master of marigolds, the empress of entomology, the blueberry boss, the heroine of hydrangea, bona fide bramble brawler, the principal of pesticides, the lord of legumes, the maestro of melons, and all-around horticultural overlord of all things alpha and omega, the illustrious Liz Hamilton. Okay, so she's very humble about this, and she gets... I actually read this to her before recording this episode that you'll just hear, but she was very embarrassed and very humble about it. But I cannot wait for you to meet her after the break. You'll be blown away at her knowledge. I feel... I learned so much from talking with her. I can't wait to have her on the show more because she really is an edible plant expert and has so much knowledge to share, very specific to the Salt Lake Valley as well, which is so helpful as we're all tending to our own gardens in this specific area. So after this break, we're going to talk about the milkweed plant and monarch butterflies. And then later in the show, we're going to really deep dive into how to properly get those vegetables that you've got ready to go planted this very soon in the next coming weeks. So that's what will be happening right after the break. Stay with us here on Gardening Utah.
She's more than just gardening puns and sage advice. It's Gardening Utah with Jenna Francis on 860 KKAT. Gardening Utah. Available wherever you get your podcasts and at 860kkat.com/garden. Here's Jenna Francis.
Welcome back to Gardening Utah. I'm Jenna Francis, and with me in our virtual Zoom studio today is as Cameron Alcott said, the illustrious Liz Hamilton.
Oh my gosh. I guess that's me.
Awfully humble. Look, I've been so excited to have you on the show. We've really wanted to work this out for a while, so I'm really happy that you took the time to be on Gardening Utah today, and especially considering you've had quite the day. Why don't you tell our listeners what you've accomplished just today?
Oh, well, I was setting fence posts to put up a new fence. I help with a donation garden where all of the giving goes to the Sandy Utah Food Bank, and we're extending by about 30 feet in both directions. And it's next to a soccer field, so we're trying to keep the soccer balls out of the tomatoes. Oh. And so we're putting up a fence line, and we registered ourselves with the monarchwatch.org. And so that also includes, part of the registration is that you promise you'll have lots of monarch butterfly food, so milkweed and flowers for the adults and things like that. So we're installing a large pollinator garden with monarchs and native bees in mind. And we're putting up a fence line to make sure it doesn't get smashed by soccer players.
Wow.
So
Okay,
did that today.
That is so cool. And where exactly is it at?
It's in Sandy. It's at Grace Lutheran Church over there. So yeah.
That is so cool. I'd love to hear that. You know, I noticed today that I've got a huge section of one of my bedding areas where I've got iris and some other, shrub roses and things. But I've got a huge amount of milkweed coming up, even into my lawn. And I know how important that is for monarch butterflies. And so I stood at it today. I was just staring down at it going, what do I do?
And I actually have the exact same problem. It's in our neighborhood as kind of a floating around weed. Like it comes up randomly and then somebody lets it go to seed and then it kind of comes up in everybody else's yard and some people take care of it and some don't. And I saw it come up in my yard and I let it go because I know how important it is. And I've let it go for 3 years. And this year it has expanded beyond the boundaries of where I wanted it to be. And it is running into my lawn and it is running throughout the flower bed. And I think last year I ended up with like 10 sprouts that came up and they were all in a place that didn't bother me. So I let them go. And I've counted at least 21 this year of just the speciosa, Asclepias speciosa. So the really big one that wants to get, 5 foot tall or whatever.
Yes.
And last year it was a fun feature piece, and this year it's about to get out of control. And so I'm not sure. I grow 3 species of milkweed in my yard. I grow tuberosa, speciosa, and then kurosavica. And the kurosavica is like the Mexican native, and it just reseeds itself freely and dies to the ground in the winter. And then the seedlings come up and flower right about the end of August. And then the tuberosa is another perennial that's not invasive. It does reseed though. So I do get baby tuberosas around my yard, which are fine though, because I just dig them up and put them where I want them once they come up. But the speciosa might have to have some some taming going on.
Is there an ideal time if you do need to sort of divide and move some milkweed? Is there a better time than another to like not harm the monarch butterflies?
Well, so in the spring before they're active, so like now, if you're trying to deal with it there, because there's no adults out right now, monarchs they're univoltine, which means they have one life cycle per season. And so there's only one season of caterpillars, one chrysalis, and one adult that hatches. And so if you can time, the moving of your milkweed or the cutting back of your milkweed before any of that happens, then you should be fine.
Okay. So you don't think I'm going to like massively, because I'm still going to leave a lot, but it's just the part that's starting to go under sort of my bedding rocks and into my lawn is what I'm really concerned about.
Yeah. And, for that area, I find that their roots are super, I don't know have you ever tried to dig up speciosa?
I haven't. It's
very deep. Okay. And it's a huge, like the size of your forearm tuber once they get established. Yeah. So digging it up and trying to move it might be really difficult.
Okay. Okay.
So, and yeah, it's kind of one of those things where if you have it in a spot that it's not going to run, so like contained on all sides by concrete or something like that is usually a better spot for it. So if you could move it to that spot and then let it go there and never think about it again, it's better than trying to contain it back to an actual flower bed that doesn't have man-made, very difficult to cross borders.
Yeah.
So.
Wow.
Yeah. It needs the right spot.
And I just realized we got talking about it, but I didn't tee up for the listeners how important the plant actually is. And maybe I'll need to put If you're listening to this and you're confused about what it looks like, I will post a picture of what we're talking about on Gardening Utah's Instagram so that you're aware of milkweed and the different species that she's mentioning. And so why don't you mention to our listeners why it is so important?
So it's the native food for the larval stage of the monarch butterfly. In the state of Utah, we have several native types of milkweed. The most noticeable is Asclepias is the genus, and the species is speciosa. So Asclepias speciosa is the main one. And there's a couple of other really fun ones like desert milkweed and things like that. Balloon flower, they're all out there. But not as common and not as noticeable as the showy milkweed or the Asclepias speciosa. The other one I mentioned, Asclepias tuberosa, is usually what you find in nurseries. So it's a perennial plant. It's typically orange or yellow, but it does come in some rarer pinks and whites. And it is the East Coast, so native to Midwest and towards the Atlantic Ocean. And it's said not to be as palatable for Western monarchs. So there's said to be two subspecies, and there's some debate as to whether or not they're actually two different subspecies or they are truly just one species. It seems like science has bounced back and forth on that, but the Western monarchs make their native flight path like up on the western side of Mexico and up into like this the west of the Rockies, and then the Eastern monarch makes their flight path up the coast of the Atlantic across the Gulf of Mexico and everywhere east of the Rockies. And so that's their mainly Eastern monarch's main source is tuberosa, and then the Western monarch's main source is speciosa. And they look very different. They don't really look similar at all. And then, purists will tell you that Western monarchs shouldn't be fed on tuberosa and vice versa. It's not their traditional food source, but I find that, monarchs, anything you can do to help a monarch is going to be good. Maybe it's not their most preferred food source, but if they can land there and they can lay their eggs and they can't find speciosa, anything's going to be better than nothing. Tuberosa tends to be very well-mannered in a garden, and so that's the perennial choice. And I want to say in 2018, it was actually the Perennial Society, U.S. Perennial Society of America's #1 perennial plant choice for the U.S. because of the monarch decline. It was tuberosa.
Wow.
Yeah. So that one's, and Kurosavica is like the Mexican milkweed, which is being outlawed in California for all kinds of reasons because it's weedy, but in Utah we don't have that problem. So you can get it readily here. It's not an issue.
Probably because of the frost.
Yeah, that's part of it too. And then they're finding that monarchs can get part of the decline of Western monarchs has to do with there's a parasite that lives on them and feeds on them, kind of like varroa mite is to bees. There is a parasite that is similar to monarch butterflies. And what they're finding is in California and all of our native milkweeds, they die to the ground, even in Southern California where it's warm out. The native milkweeds will die to the ground while they're doing their annual cycle. But the Kurosavica, the Mexican milkweed, actually won't. It will stay evergreen through their mild winters, and it doesn't die to the ground. And what's happening is that mite, that parasite, is wintering over and living just fine on the native milkweed or the Mexican milkweed, and it's causing continued reinfection, which doesn't happen on natives. And so there's a lot of articles out there telling you absolutely do not plant Mexican milkweed. It's super bad for them. It harbors mites, but that doesn't apply in Utah to us because it does not stay evergreen or live through our winters here at all like it does in California.
Wow.
So,
okay.
Again, if you can plant it, it's good help for them.
Yeah. And so when do we start seeing the monarchs around the milkweed plants?
Usually July.
Yeah.
because that's about when their life cycles are start. So insect life cycles are measured in heat units, not in time. So depending on how warm the weather is how fast their molts go and how quickly their days to maturity are. It's based on, it's called degree days. So how many degrees it is over a certain amount affects when you see hatch.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So now,
that's all insects.
yeah, sounds like we could do a few shows on just insects alone, and beneficial ones at that too.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing better than seeing a monarch butterfly. And you're right. When I was a kid, I remember just seeing them all over. I mean, I grew up here, and when we see a monarch now, it's like an amazing moment. It's like, text your husband, come outside, come look.
Right. They're considered, the Western monarch is considered critically endangered. Eastern monarchs last year are on the watch list. And they have, in years, they have seen extreme declines in numbers. But last year in 2019, they saw a jump in Eastern monarch numbers for the first time in decades.
Wow.
But the Western monarch is still going down, even with all the conservation efforts that are happening. They're not seeing an uptick. And so there's a concern that the Western monarch, which is our monarch, is going to be gone soon if we don't really turn it around.
Okay. Well, everybody, Gardening Utah listeners, stay with me and keep your milkweed in your garden. Well, when we come back right after this, Liz and I are going to walk you through how to get your vegetable plants in the garden, because it's time for growing. Stay with us.
860 KKAT with Jenna Francis and Gardening Utah, where it's always mulch time. She really does have the nicest yard on the block. It's Gardening Utah with Jenna Francis on 860 KKAT.
Welcome back to Gardening Utah. I'm Jenna Francis, and with me in our virtual studio is Liz Hamilton, and I'm just going to go ahead and say it now. I know Cameron Alcott gave you all these cool descriptions that we read at the beginning of this episode, but I'm just going to add garden genius to the conversation.
I like to think it's I'm more of like a savant. It's the only thing I can do.
Oh, geez. I'm just blown away at all the different, the species and the names and everything that you just have rolling off the tip of your tongue like it's no big deal. And it's just so obvious to all. So I'm so impressed. It's so fun talking to you.
Thanks.
So we're going to give Utah gardeners some tips on how to get their vegetables in properly. I've been anticipating this particular show because it's the Saturday before Mother's Day, technically. I mean, you may be, as a listener, you may be binging this podcast at another time, and this episode still will be very, very useful to you, I'm sure, just from the information alone. But technically, it's less risky to put in the garden from this weekend on as far as frost dates. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, our average last frost date, it usually coincides with Mother's Day weekend. And so for the most part, I mean, nothing is ever 100%, right? I don't know if you've seen the recent forecast that they're, which doesn't affect us at all, but that they're predicting for the New England, but they're saying it's going to be a historically ridiculous snowstorm that's rolling in for them in the next 3 to 4 days. And I know people up there plant about the same time we do, because even though the latitude might be a little bit different, our elevation puts us usually in about the similar zone. And so yes. You never really know.
You really don't. In fact, I was telling you earlier that this morning I looked on my little Facebook memories, and 10 years ago today, and this is the Thursday before Mother's Day. 10 years ago today, I was upset because the garden had frozen. So, this time of year it's a little bit risky, but of course it's less risky. So, I mean, make your own choices, everyone. Everyone's sense of risk is a little bit different, but we're going to go over some of the things that you really need to consider when you're putting those vegetables in the ground, because before, there's so many things you can do to really set yourself up for success. And once that that vegetable's in the ground, there's really not much other chance to change much. So you really want to just set it up and do it right. So Liz, tell me some of the things that you're always looking for, and what's the best advice you would give as far as like starting out?
So if you're starting out and you've never placed, like you don't even have a flower bed or anything like that, the very first thing you need to do is decide where that's going to go. Where your raised box is, where you're going to cut out that sod. And the first considerations for your site should be the exposure of that site. How much sun is it getting? Most vegetables would prefer a minimum of 8 hours a day or more. 12 is ideal for maximum production at least. But 8 is okay if you can swing it. Anything less, you're going to see diminished production and usually fungal and pest issues because those plants are stressed because they're not photosynthesizing and respirating at the rate that they ought to be to ensure maximum health and maximum production for the vegetables. So once you've picked that out, so decide you can, and that's just, I've had people ask me what app they can download to tell them what the sun exposure is of an area. And as far as I know, there's no such thing that exists. You just need to watch it. So measure it in the morning, measure it in the afternoon, measure it in the evening, see what that looks like. And then once you've picked that out, the next consideration I think needs to be, your watering source. So if you have a really large yard and you're putting your garden on the edge of your half-acre plot that's nowhere near your watering source, considering that, like how often you're going to be able to get out there and water if you don't have a sprinkler system set up, those things are important because plants need water. In our climate, once we hit 90, usually every day and sometimes twice a day if you're gardening in raised beds. We were talking a little bit about soil, but what you get is where you live is what you get, right? Like, so we can't really change that, but we can amend it to a degree.
Yes.
So like I live in Sandy and most of my stuff is like decomposed granite, which is super terrible. So I like raised beds and it's easy to garden in because you get to choose what you put into them.
Yes.
I actually prefer to use potting soil for raised beds. Because to me, it's just a giant pot and potting soil is easy. It's pre-fertilized, so you know exactly what you're getting. It's set up to hold moisture well, like if it was in a pot, so your plants will retain more moisture from that way. But you can certainly use whatever you have on hand. Potting soil can be expensive if you're buying in bulk and you have large beds, so something else to consider. I think for space requirements, in-ground gardening is the way to go. I mean, because your square footage is maximized and you can change it every year. So if something didn't work for you, you can redesign the layout every single year and upgrade. Whereas once you build raised beds, the design you have is the design you have, and changing it is going to be a kind of a chore for you if you end up deciding you don't like what you're doing. So there's advantages and disadvantages to both. So decide what you're going to do, if you're going to be in raised beds or not, and then look at your layout for maximum production. So you're going to put, ideally it's in the south side of the bed. You're not on the north side of the house. You're getting full sun, not shade.
Yeah.
And you have access to good water. If you can set up drip lines, highly recommend you do so. If you're on overhead sprinklers, it is what it is. But if you can put your vegetable bed on its own zone so it waters itself and not tied into the lawn or things like that. And I realize that's not always ideal for people. Like, it is what it's going to be. It's hard to redesign sprinkler systems and run a whole new zone if that's not an option.
Yeah.
But ideally it's on its own zone because tomato plants are going to need less water than grass and trees and your established shrubs, things like that. Annuals always require more water. And then from there, pick your amendments. And the best thing to do, if you're gardening in raised beds, then your soil's pre-amended. But if you're in ground, then you're going to have to. The best course of action there is getting a soil test. So sending your soil sample into the USU USOL lab, or BYU also has a lab. I'm not sure what the name of that one is, but they will test your soil and tell you what your pH is. Tell you your organic matter, if you're high or low in nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium. And then you can, if you need to amend, you'll know exactly what you need to do.
Interesting. I totally agree. I need to get a soil test for my soil as well. But when we come back after this break, we're going to go into more about how to put in the perfect plants for your garden. Stay with us.
She's more than just gardening puns and sage advice. It's Gardening Utah with Jana Francis on 860 KKAT. 860 KKAT with more of the fastest growing show on radio. It's Gardening Utah with Jana Francis.
Welcome back to Gardening Utah. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Jana Francis, and I'm here in our virtual studio with Liz Hamilton, the illustrious and genius Liz Hamilton.
Oh my gosh.
And we're having so much fun talking about a lot of different things. But before the break, we were talking a lot about preparing your garden for vegetable planting. And the main things that we've reviewed so far, if you're just barely catching up with us, is the site, where you're going to put your garden in, and then the soil, obviously making sure that it's amended, and whether it's a raised bed or not, making sure that soil is going to be proper for the vegetables, and then sunshine, making sure your plants are going to be getting at least 8 hours of sun a day. That's a lot of S words, isn't it? So I'm thinking, and as I think about it, the next portion that we were going to jump into is selection, as far as what is it that you do actually plant? And when people ask me that question, I'm really interested to see if you differ or have any additional thoughts. But the main thing I say is, what does your family like to eat?
That's what I would say too. What are you going to put on the table?
Exactly. And
that people will consume.
Exactly. I mean, I had a friend of mine last year that grew a whole bunch of Brussels sprouts. She doesn't even like Brussels sprouts. And she was just like, I don't know what to do with all of these. And so now listen, I am famous for growing way more food than I can possibly eat. I do that because I get so personally invested in all the different varieties of, tomatoes and really rare squash and watermelons and things like that I love to test out and try. But I am very, very good at preserving, all of the, even I'll make hot sauce until 3:00 in the morning if I have to, just to make sure I don't waste one serrano pepper. You know what I mean?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. So I've been there. I've been there with you.
Seriously. So as far as, that's the main thing I would tell people is, what is it that you actually eat? And obviously only plant one zucchini.
Yeah. Don't overdo it.
Yeah. It's so funny. So many people have zucchini literally coming out their ears, but into the fall. And it's like, why did I plant so many? But you just get so anxious, right? To finally get growing again. So what else would you have to say as far as plant selection?
Making sure that they're going to be something that's going to ripen for you on time. I mean, so yeah, your family needs to eat it. It needs to be palatable, something you're going to fix and enjoy, but also something you're going to have success with. So a lot of times I'll see people plant melons and squash that are 120 plus days to maturity, which is really, for us in our growing season, pushing it.
Yeah.
And so that was always the consideration when I was farming, as to, okay, my deadline to rip this out is, a certain time. And if I grow this, was it going to be a huge rambling vine that I get, maybe if I'm lucky, 1 or 2 ripe melons or squash on? So watermelons are notorious for having long ripening times. The really big ones, like the Crimson Sweets and stuff, sometimes they just, if you don't get them in ground and it's not warm enough and it doesn't expedite that growing season, you don't get a melon, or it just gets big and then you hit your first frost and it's devastating. And some of the pumpkins are that way too. I don't know if you've ever grown, Cinderella pumpkins or any of those, but they push that boundary of just barely making it before your first frost. So I would consider days to maturity.
Yes.
In that as well. And then, things that are going to do well here. So like, I don't know why this probably wouldn't affect our viewers, but like, you wouldn't want to grow taro elephant root.
Right.
because it grows like rice. You're not going to grow rice here. So picking things that aren't going to be super demanding, I think, are important.
Yeah. I totally agree. And as far as selection goes too, one thing that just occurred to me is, if you haven't planted your seeds indoors, some do, some don't, some do a little bit of a mix. I realize, some of the advice that I will always say is the smaller the better, in my opinion. When you're seeing that squash plant in the store or even the pepper plant, I feel like the smaller the plant is, the better success you have with it actually taking root in your garden. And when I say small, I'm not talking about the root base. I'm talking about making sure that like that squash plant isn't already flowering in the pot at the store. Yeah. It really should just have those very first set of baby leaves and one or two leaves from there, because they don't really like to be root bound as it is and tend to flower prematurely. I mean, do you agree with me on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the larger the plants are in a small pot, the more stressed their root system is going to be, especially with cucurbits for sure. But tomatoes will do the same thing. And then they all express stress differently, but typically that looks like stunting. In tomatoes, we see stress manifest itself as blossom end rot. A lot of people feel like that's a calcium deficiency, but really recent science tells us it's actually an overproduction of the gibberellin hormone in the plant that causes a stress response, and the plant's stress response is to pull calcium out of the fruit and hoard it back into the plant, and that causes the blossom end rot, not a lack of calcium in the plant itself. And so we see stress in tomatoes like if you plant too soon, because we kind of talked about that, and you get like cold temperatures. And for tomatoes, it's under 50. So if you have tomatoes planted in the ground this week already, last night, I don't know, most of the valley saw temps in low 40s and high 30s. And that is stressful for plants. And that could, in susceptible varieties, manifest itself as mealy, grainy, blossom end rot, stressed plants in the next few weeks as they begin to produce. And so in pumpkins and squash, we see a stunting of their growth cycle, which when you're looking at long-vined, slow to mature crops anyway, any type of stunting that's going to take 3 or 4, even 2 weeks off their maturity, days to maturity is something that you're trying to avoid. And in addition, stressed plants, besides having abiotic disorders like blossom end rot or stunting, stressed plants send out signals to insects and other predators that that they're already in decline. And oftentimes we see insect infestations is a secondary infestation or infection to something that was already stressed and unhappy in the ground in the first place. So adhering to plant small and plant early, and don't keep your big plants and not planting early, and keeping your big plants upsizing the right pot for the right plant if you do end up planting early. Because I'll see people that are like, oh, do I really have to pot it up again? It's tall, but if I water it every day, it doesn't wilt. And it's like, well, look at the ratio of the top of the plant to the size of the pot that it's in. If the top of the plant's 18 inches tall and you've got it in a little 4-inch can, it doesn't matter how many times you water it a day, it is not a happy plant. And so
isn't that
knowing that, like, upsize when you can. If the plant's too big for the pot, do it, because you're going to be reducing those stressors for that plant. And in the end, you'll have better fruit earlier, sooner, healthier, less pests, less stress. It's hard to wait. We all want to get it in the ground and get it moving. And then it's hard to spend time up potting plants into gallon containers because the next 15-day forecast says there is going to be a late frost and now you have to wait. Well, take the time. Do you want a successful harvest? Because it's directly proportional to how much time you put into those plants if you're starting from seed.
I could not agree more. And I actually tested this last year in my own garden in some raised beds. I had 2 tomato plants that I had started really early and then way too early. And then others that I had just started right on time and they were the perfect size to put in the ground that I was waiting on. And I thought, I'm just going to put these in now. So it was at the end of April that I put those in. And I still kind of protected them when I remembered with like buckets and things. But I kept all my other seeds and plants inside and, protected with my, the growing light and whatnot. But I am not exaggerating when I tell you that the waiting and being patient and putting in my tomatoes and my peppers and everything else that I planted over Mother's Day weekend, those tomato plants eventually outgrew the other two that were much bigger when I put those in the ground because they did get stressed from the weather.
They usually do. And not just the weather, just transplanting in general. So I did a similar experiment several years ago where I started zucchini indoors and not early, like right on time, 3 weeks before planting date, right? So I just had like the cotyledons and then 2 leaves on top. I mean, they were small, just like you get at the store. And I planted them all out, and on the same day in a row right next to it, so it was a row of 50 zucchini, black beauty zucchini. And in the row right next to it, I cut holes in the 50-foot row and I sowed seed. So just seed, directly sowed black beauty zucchini.
Yeah.
And those zucchini came up, overproduced, and took off faster than the other. And I mean, same light, same exposure, same field, same water on the same line. And the seed outgrew the other. So it almost wasn't even worth buying the plants when I could have spent $5 on seed for a 50-foot row instead of $5 a plant for a 50-foot row.
Okay.
Or started them early.
Listen to that, Gardening Utah listeners. I mean, that is just, so it's not too late. Don't feel like you have to go to the garden center and buy established plants necessarily. Go buy the seed because, that's such a good tip.
Yeah. I mean, and of course that's not going to work for tomatoes and peppers and things like that need a head start in our climate. Yes. But squash, almost any squash, you could just plant directly in the ground. I mean, think about any planter that you've ever seen that gets transplanted. It never enjoys it, even when you're super delicate. And plants that come up, like if you've ever had volunteer pumpkins or anything like that come up in your garden, think about how early they come up, how healthy they are, how big they look, and how crazy productive they get, and much sooner than anything you'd even put in the ground, right?
Absolutely.
Like I remember I had my volunteer pumpkins come up one year, and I ended up with fully orange, ripe, beautiful orange pumpkins by the end of July because they had come up from seed and were so happy with the location that they were in, and I didn't move them.
Wow.
So
nature at its best, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they don't want to move. They would prefer that you just put them in the ground and let them go.
Oh, wow.
Even with our best babying, they're going to be happier if you just planted them from seed in the ground.
Absolutely. Well, Liz, I can't believe how fast the time has gone. I could talk to you for hours and hours about this. So we're definitely going to have you back on a regular basis, anytime that works for you. I'm so happy to have you here. It's been such a delight. Thanks for joining us on Gardening Utah, and can't wait to have you back.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's been super fun.
Well, that's it for today's episode of Gardening Utah, and all I have to say is everything that Cameron Alcott had me read about Liz at the beginning of this episode absolutely rings true. What a wealth of information, and how fun it was to pick her brain and learn from her. As always, let us know what you would like to see on our show. Message us on Instagram. Our handle is @GardeningUtah. And if you would like to have Liz come have a look at your garden and walk around and potentially plot the perfect vegetable garden for you, go to progressiveplants.com and click the design button and see what that would entail. Make sure to subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts so that you never miss an episode. I'm Jana Francis. Shout out to our producer, Lambo. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next week on Gardening Utah. And remember, grow big or go home.
When you're ready to grow big or go home, make your neighbors green with envy. Get the Gardening in Utah podcast, Gardening Utah, available wherever you get your podcasts and at 860kkat.com/garden.